Hey, what up, guys? Brian here. I'm just here to give you a quick rundown as to what I've been studying for the past couple of months. And before I jump right into the presentation, I'm gonna give you guys a quick scenario, just to get you guys in the right state of mind to see why this technology should even be relevant. Why, like, you're probably thinking, Brian, why should I even care about this? Well, let me tell you about it. Cool. So up until this point, I'm pretty sure all of us have done a brain death or a DAT scan, something to do with the brain, right? And generally speaking, depending on how severe, where the patient has Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, the more progressive the illness is, the harder it is to work with the patient. So we've all had that one patient who, you get them on the bed, and, let's say we're doing a DAT scan, you get them on the bed, you get them set up, you put the tourniquet on the forehead, and you ask them, please do not move, because any movement will throw an artifact into our picture that will invalidate it. It won't work. The radiologist can't read it. We'll have to start over. It's hard. It's more time for you on the camera. I know you're uncomfortable. Just please stay still, and we'll try and get this done as quickly as possible. Okay? So you get started. Patient's being imaged, and halfway through, they get a little tremor, start coughing, they start looking left and right, start moving their head, and that throws a whole bunch of artifacts, and oh my goodness, whole study's ruined. Boom. This is where the ambulatory PET camera comes into play. In theory, this camera design, or these camera designs, because there's more than one, there's several prototypes that have been simulated, and there's a couple that have actually been used on people. These designs were made or designed to improve patient comfort, uh, reduce the dose needed, because since the targeted area is so close to the detectors, you don't really need to have a dose, and to overall help these patients who can't stay still. And with that being said, I'll jump right into figure A. So, as you guys can see, figure A is the most commonly used dedicated PET design, dedicated brain PET imaging design, should I say. It's HHRT, the high resolution research tomograph. And as the name implies, it's a research detector. Most of these detectors that I'm going to show you, 99% of them are not used in a clinical setting. They are merely proof of concept that are being in development and are being improved to the point where they can have enough consistent acuity to be used in a clinical setting. So, with that said, take everything I say with a grain of salt. So, figure A was it was designed to have a compact geometry, and the overall goal was to have a spatial resolution of around 2.5 millimeters across the brain. So, in order to do that, they had an octagonal detector block arrangement with 64 oh crap, I suck at saying this, lutetium oxyorthosilic crystals attached to photomultiplier tubes, and it was bi-layered. As I mentioned, or probably not mentioned, they had DOI capability, and DOI essentially relates to detection of incident modules. These modules help differentiate actual annihilation photons from non-collinear events. So they help differentiate from actual events and stuff that's just scatter noise, degrading the image, stuff that didn't actually happen. Um, since it was bi-layered, there's different levels of doping spread across each layer of the crystals, and pulse discrimination was allowed by differentiating the uh, the energy levels being output. And then that brings me on to figure B. So figure A and B are similar in literally only one way. They're both essentially circular. Um, Figure A, they were spaced around 47 centimeters apart. I'm sorry, millimeters. And figure B was spaced right around 36 centimeters apart in diameter. So it's a more compact design and had a lot more hardware involved. So figure B differs from figure A because it is essentially, instead of being a dual stack, it's a four stack arrangement of, oh my goodness, I suck at saying this, gadolinium orthosilic crystals. The DOI information, detection of incident information, was obtained by varying the dopant level between the layers. And the scintillator arrays, these little arrays, these four module blocks, were read out by 256 channel photomultiplier tubes. As you guys can see, these are 4 layers stacked on top of each other, 24 blocks in diameter, stacked 5 rings deep. So, the double-edged sword essentially hurting the advancement in this modality was a couple things. One being the advancements in MRI, and I'll touch on that right at the end. But the other one being that you can either have a really lightweight design that doesn't have that much spatial acuity or resolution, or you could have a heavier, more expensive, costly design that has incredible resolution, but the price and the material costs are so astronomical that it isn't really viable to be used in a clinical setting because you don't really need a dedicated brain imaging camera. So, sorry, I had to take a sip of water. Now that brings me on to figure A in the middle. So, as you can see in this middle picture, there's this weird, essentially like robotic Terminator type arm hanging over this girl's head, holding this circular arrangement of detectors onto her head. And essentially, the arm is there to take the weight off of the patient's neck because, as you guys can imagine, these detectors are not light. You know, each detector block weighs around 2.5 kilos, and when you combine 12 of those together, it ends up to right around 22-25 pounds. And that's a lot of weight to be holding on your neck for a sustained period of time. So, this pulley system, as you guys can see in this figure above and below, were designed to take the majority of the tension off of the patient's neck, allow the patient to rotate their head from the right to the left, and allow for the patient comfort. You know, a lot of variables were taken into effect when designing this helmet. Patient comfort was primarily one of them, but also acuity. So, this design came out of a group of researchers led by Julie B. Lewis in West Virginia University. And essentially, this design is one of the few designs in the entire world that was actually tested with live patients, that actually had students come in who had a PET scan earlier and signed up to, be basically a piggy, a test piggy for this technology. Because, it's inherently not safe and also kind of not cool to give a patient an F-18 dose just to be a test subject for a non-functional or non-FDA approved piece of equipment. So the university worked with what they had, and they asked students, hey, if you had an F-18 study today, if you had a PET study today, we'll pay you to come into our department in a couple hours and help us out by taking some images. All you have to do is just sit down, let us put this helmet design on you, and get some images for about 10 minutes, and you'll be on your way. So about 12 students complied, and they complied and underwent the studies. And unfortunately, I wasn't able, no matter how many times I requested the school or the professors to give me a picture or a copy of those images, they just refused because they use proprietary software. There was a whole bunch of loopholes that they would just not allow me to get those images. But they essentially were able to give me the parameters that they use in order to recreate those images. So, doses range were around 2 to 4 simulated millicuries. As I mentioned, the students either got a PET study earlier in the day, waited about 4 hours, and then took the images to simulate a reduced dose of F-18 FDG. And the coincidence timing window used for the acquisition was around 10 nanoseconds. The energy window was about 400 to 600 keV for all measurements, and the activity in the peak activity in the field of view was right around 300 microcuries, which is really, really small. The spatial resolution was approximately 2 millimeters in the tangential direction, which is close to from the outside of the head to the detector, and 2 millimeters in the radial direction, 2.8 millimeters in the radial direction. and the absolute efficiency was right around 0.07%, 0.7%. And I'm sure you guys are going to have a ton of questions after I go over this. So you're probably bored out of your minds at this point. But let me just get through it and I'll explain. And feel free to ask any questions after the presentation. As you guys see below, this is a Siemens camera. This is one of the initial camera designs that was actually put in the clinical setting for research purposes. This is similar to the camera used at the VA, shout out VA. And essentially what the PET MRI camera allows is for acute integration of PET technology, the brain technology, along with MRI imaging capabilities. As you guys know, MRI doesn't require any radiation, and in brain imaging doesn't need that much radiation to begin with, so you can have a really clear, concise image that evaluates anatomy and physiology, metabolic activity at the same exact time. Well, not exact, but overlays the images in an accurate manner. Another cool thing to note is that these PET cameras can actually be integrated into most modern day PET cameras. So in theory, after the generations, more iterations of this technology progresses and it becomes more concise and more compact, it can be integrated into a PET camera to help analyze anatomy and metabolic activity at the same time. And that brings me on to image C. So I've mentioned this previously. I already spoke on the dosages that came along with it. But this is just a picture showing you one of the dedicated, one of these standalone brain imaging cameras used for research. So essentially, the patient's head goes inside the little tube. They're laying down supinated on a bed. And essentially, the detector arrangement goes around the patient's head for a couple minutes and acquires an image. And that brings me on to these pictures in the lower left-hand section. And I know what you're thinking. What is this? Is this Tron? Is this a helmet? What is this? It doesn't look real. And you're probably right. No, you're actually right. These are simulated images. So these are proposed designs coming out of a team in Japan led by physicist Yamamoto and his team. These are designs simulated in CAD and CAM software. I proposed an arrangement that, they essentially wanted to figure out what's the best design to get the greatest spatial resolution possible. They didn't really care that much for patient comfort, weight, size. They just wanted to get the best possible image of the brain. Unfortunately, they didn't have any live test subjects, no children, rats, adults, anything. But they did manage to simulate the images using phantoms and simulated dummies, as you can see in the CAD software over here in figure B. So, as you guys can probably imagine, or you're probably wondering, why is the guy in figure B wearing a VR headset? Like, what's the purpose of that? One of the proposed ideas was that since the patients are going to be that close in a confined space in that design, they didn't want to become claustrophobic. So they figured if they put virtual reality goggles on top of the patient, it would help alleviate stress and make the study more comfortable. Inherently, a lot of the roadblocks they didn't take into account was patient comfort. One being, this is extremely heavy. How are you going to suspend that? How is that going to be on the patient's head? And also, helmets get hot. There's no there's no area for heat dissipation in this arrangement at all, in either of these arrangements. So these two designs are incredibly uncomfortable and unrealistic for actual clinical and patient use. And that brings me on to image E, which is a actual design led by the same team. This is called the PET hat. So essentially, the way this mechanism functions, it can rotate in a 360-degree circle, and it can rotate above the patient's head. The patient pulls up a chair to the imaging camera. They sit down, and then the camera essentially lowers down over around the eyebrow level and acquires an image while the patient just sits there. And it's pretty comfortable for the patient. The camera's mobile, and there's a lot of pros to it. And that's to mention the detector arrangement for for the camera seen, the internals of this camera seen here relate to the arrangement seen in figure B right here. So those internals inside this arrangement. And essentially what they did, essentially did the same thing that the study in West Virginia University did. They did the same thing these guys. They proposed a design, but unfortunately they weren't able to get actual live patients, so they also used simulated images. Um, and I was also unable to get um, parameters and images from this specific camera right here. And then, last but not least, future developments. So, as you guys can probably see, advancements in this modality have been hindered by advancements, leaps and bounds in MRI. MRI has, over the past couple of years, taken forefront in interest because of the acuity and the types of images that they can acquire and the lack of radiation exposure. Downside being that images sometimes take a long time to acquire and they're really uncomfortable with patients who are laying down for a long time. But these ambulatory PET cameras, in theory, can be used to provide real breakthroughs in imaging people, either athletes or people who have autism, or evaluating if somebody has CTE, if there's an MMA fighter who has brain damage. They, in theory, can provide a lot of diagnostic imaging information when used in the clinical setting. But up until this point, they're all merely concepts. And that concludes my entire presentation. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll try to answer them as quickly as I can. And have a good evening, day, morning, day.